put the 167 mark into the chat just so everyone is sort of aware where approximately we are in time.
So we've got 7 minutes, right? We've got 7 minutes, right?
Yes, you do.
Okay.
Perfect.
So I will start the timer now. Hello, everyone. I am Mert from Opening Government. I'll be your first speaker. And to introduce, I would like to just set out a model for our actions. So we are not saying as government that we would have South Korea arm itself with an extreme amount of nuclear weapons. For example, the amount of nuclear weapons the US has, which numbers nearly in the thousands. We would have them having a reasonable amount of nuclear weapons that would be able to grant them autonomy militarily, especially from the United States, and prevent them and prevent threats from attacking them, the most prevalent one being North Korea. So to start out our arguments, when we talk about autonomy, we know that nuclear weapons grant any country that own them a lot of military autonomy, because as they have nuclear weapons, not many powerful countries would like to use them as proxies to engage in proxy wars with other countries that are also powerful who have nuclear weapons, which would of course make them autonomous. And also, as South Korea is somewhat of a proxy, again, of the United States in the northeastern Asia region, granting South Korea autonomy militarily from the United States would also help us in giving other countries in the northeastern Asia areas more independence from giant countries such as the United States, as the United States would of course be losing a quite powerful, economically speaking and militarily speaking as well, proxy in South Korea. Now, also, when we talk about proxies, of course, the fact that proxy wars would be quite easily terminated if South Korea had nuclear weapons. We should remember that quite firmly. And now coming to our third argument. So North Korea has bombs for itself. South Korea should have bombs as well, because this would help them somewhat ease the tensions in between each other, because of course they wouldn't really be wanting to engage in military conflicts with normal guns, of course, because conflicts with normal guns, if the countries have nuclear bombs, can lead to a nuclear conflict, which of course no one wants, because well, we're talking about the destruction of your country here. And of course, South Korea having nuclear weapons would scare North Korea, which would mean, again, which would become another factor in the easing of tensions in between the two countries. So what I've talked about here in this speech is I've talked mostly about autonomy, independence, and of course, we all know that South Korea is a country that yearns for independence from military giants such as the United States, because we know that its economy is quite quickly gaining speed. Of course, we believe as the government that its military should also, and we also believe that every single country deserves its own military and economic independence from other countries, which would turn the world into less of a war zone and less of a hotspot for tension, diplomatically speaking. Because when you look at South Korea and North Korea tensions, we see South Korea really, I guess, because it doesn't have nuclear weapons of its own, but the US has nuclear weapons of its own, it's not really able to have much of a very fruitful and independent relationship with North Korea. It can only have a dependent relationship on North Korea that dependence being, of course, on the power of the United States. But if we grant it autonomy, things might shape out differently than they are today, and well, they're not going really well today, then because the US would, of course, be losing authority on Asia and, well, would be giving independence to South Korea. And South Korea would then, of course, be weakening the US's authority as it gains independence, which means that most of the region would also have a chance, have a go at independence, which we, of course, want to see. Thank you.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for that fine speech and call on the Leader of the Opposition to open the case of the opposition.
Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I'm Tuna. I'm the second member of the first team, and I'm going to actually widen the argument that Mert gave by actually looking some concrete examples in history, looking at the situation today, and as well as assuming a scenario in which South Korea obtained nuclear weapons. So I would like to start saying saying that South Korea is a nation longing for self-determination. It had actually suffered a very bad history. The World War II actually followed the invasion of South Korea by Japanese, and following the defeat of Japanese by the United States actually went forward on its mission objectives and started invading South Korea. Why? Because South Korea was a base near the Soviet Union, the United States' main new enemy. So what we had at that time was a growing American influence, and by growing I mean a lot of American influence on the southern part, and a growing Soviet influence on the northern part, and actually leaders coming into rule in both parts, actually supported by the USSR and US respectively. And you all know that a war break out between those countries. The first speaker said that those countries had a war, so the relationships between them won't be nice today. But I would like to say that we can interpret history as a game of hate. Like many history books say that the Korean War started because Kim Il-sung's army actually started invading South Korea with a fast assault, but that's simply unrealistic. Why would you just go around and invade a country knowing that knowing the casualties that you're going to get? It was actually a proxy war triggered by some external force, either the USSR and the States. But I'm not going to argue that here because it's pretty controversial. But I would like to say that the Korean War was a total proxy war. It was not a war between the North Koreans and the South Koreans. It wasn't like that. I would like to give you some examples specifically on the South Korean side. So what happened in Korean War with South Korea? Now, all of you know that most of the infantry that was carried to the zone was by NATO. It was including the Turkish soldiers. I mean, the Turkish soldiers were thousands of miles away from the region, but still they were carried to that site. They required external support. The NATO actually supported the ferrying of soldiers to the mobilization of soldiers to such zone. It wasn't the South Korea's army. And the critical operation in the war, called the Incheon Assault, was actually carried out by the joint UN force, not the South Korean Navy. Like, see the dimension of this thing. A joint UN force fighting another joint Soviet force. And we still say that it's a conflict between North Korea and South Korea and falsely interpret the situation. As a result, we had the Korean Peninsula as a total mess of proxy war. But the situation has started changing today. Of course, there had been conflicts, but how this situation carried in past history was in form of gunboat diplomacy. There were a lot of minor conflicts occurring in the 38th parallel, the newly assumed border of those two countries. And the first thing that happened after those conflicts was actually the mobilization of a carrier fleet to there by the United States. I mean, why? Just question this one. You just have a conflict between North and Southern Korea, and to support Southern Korea, the United States sends an aircraft carrier miles away, and you say that this is a conflict between the Koreans. And also, South Korea today houses one of the largest F-16 fleets in the world. They actually have most of their air force, a strong air force supported by the United States. I'm not going to give more examples of it. I'm not going to give how much Sherman tanks are there in their land force, but I'm just going to say that the South Korean military and economy is actually controlled by the United States today. But the situation has changed today because North Korea has somehow obtained nuclear weapons. But to our interest, nobody actually interprets how North Korea got those nuclear weapons. It's actually said that they got the documents from Pakistan of building nuclear weapons. The thing is that I actually have some knowledge in nuclear physics, and you have to get some pretty enriched uranium to build those bombs. And it's easy to enrich a little amount of uranium that much, and that's why North Korea has a limited supply of working nuclear weapons. But our opposition said that they're just going to build more and more and more weapons, which is unrealistic because it's hard to produce such highly enriched uranium. That's why we have a lot of other countries with their amount of nuclear weapons limited, because it's not easy to enrich uranium-235 after concentration of 90%, such that they are going to be used in weapons and produce thousands of those weapons. Why did Russia and the States achieve that? Because they had the control of uranium mines. North Korea and South Korea don't have control of uranium mines. They are not going to get the uranium required to actually produce more and more and more bombs, as our opposition said. That's why India only has 100 weapons today. That's why Israel only has 80 weapons today, because uranium, enriched uranium, is scarce. And other countries are not accepting the help of enriched uranium to external countries, and instead converting them into reactor-grade fuel. So what we have today is just North Korea, with information with Pakistan, producing a limited amount of nuclear weapons. What South Korea can today do is following a similar procedure, taking the documents from, for example, Japan, which also houses some nuclear data, not weapons, obviously, and actually produce a limited amount of weapons in terms of that. Now, what conversion will occur in this instance will be a transition from gunboat diplomacy, in which there was actually an arms race, as our opposition say, into a nuclear diplomacy state, in which the arms race will settle down. So you might say that there was also an arms race between the Soviet Union and the United States, despite they had nuclear weapons. And I would like to say that the reasoning of that isn't because the United States or the Soviet Union wants to invade each other with their actual arms. They produced those arms because they wanted to help the proxy battlefields. Those arms weren't for themselves. So if we interpret this hypothesis into the case of North-South Korea, if South Korea actually obtained nuclear weapons, that would actually settle down the arms race of both countries. South Korea won't actually be, as I mentioned, won't actually be too dependent in producing nuclear weapons to the United States. So it will actually improve South Korea's self-determination and actually reduce the probability of having some proxy elements interfering with the conflict. Our opposition said that the conflict will grow because the arms will actually grow in number, but I would like to conclude my argument by saying that you can't simply just produce more and more and more of nuclear weapons. You can't just copy and paste them. You have to have the resources to produce them. That's why it will actually silence down the gunboat diplomacy and bring a more calmer and a milder nuclear diplomacy into the region. Thank you for your consideration.
I would like to thank the Deputy Prime Minister for that fine speech and call on the Deputy Leader of Opposition to close out the top half.
Yes, that's me. Is everything working?
Yes, it is.
Okay, brilliant. In that case, I shall start. We as the opening opposition believe that actually it would be very harmful in many ways for South Korea to create more nuclear, or to start creating nuclear weapons on a larger scale. First off, I'd like to state a couple of points of rebuttal, and then I will go into what creating nuclear weapons would mean for the rest of society, South Korean society, and also what would happen to the region and the allies, so to speak, if they were to create nuclear weapons. First, a couple of points of rebuttal. The opening government stated that actually South Korean nuclear weapons would ease the tension, but we think that since North Korea has quite an authoritarian regime, it would actually be the opposite. The reaction would be that they'd feel threatened, and authoritarian states are very likely, that's been evident throughout history, to see everything, even the slightest increase in production, as a provocation and a threat. So we believe that as my colleague has already stated that this would increase, that this would lead to an armament race. Also, the second point of rebuttal is, yes, you said that in the opening government that the amounts of nuclear weapons that can be created is limited, but we think that even though there can't be millions and millions of nuclear weapons created just in the blink of an eye, it could trigger a new armament race. You don't have to create nuclear weapons constantly for other nations to feel threatened. Even if you just start creating nuclear weapons, other nations will feel threatened. And once you have a trigger for an armament race, there's no looking back, really. And that brings me on to the first very important point that we'd like to make against production of nuclear weapons in South Korea, which is we don't think it would stabilize the region at all, because in every region there are sub-alliances between different countries. You know, every country has better or worse relations with neighboring countries. And we believe that, for example, if South Korea were to create more nuclear weapons, countries around North Korea, for example, China, would go further towards North Korea and towards supporting them, and other countries, for example, the US or countries in the region around South Korea, would shift towards supporting South Korea. So we'd have new battlefronts, really. And that would also, and that's the second point, probably be taken out on the rest of society, so to speak, because the focus would be on military again. And because there can't be infinite focus points for governments, other aspects would suffer. So if the South Korean government were to focus on the military aspect and on creating more nuclear weapons, the money would be lacking elsewhere. And if other countries were to do this as well, because they'd foresee, you know, a new arms race situation, those countries would probably do the same. They'd probably increase the number of weapons they have, they own, they produce as well. Meaning that that money would not go towards, for example, education or infrastructure and all the very important sectors that really require constant financial support. Oh, point of interest, sorry. What is your reason that authoritarian regimes are aggressive against external issues? I don't necessarily mean militarist by authoritarian. It's just that, for example, Kim Jong-un has been proven, I mean, just look at the situation with the US a couple of years ago, to see even the slightest threat as, you know, or aggressive remark as a threat, that way around. And his reaction was equally aggressive. So it's quite realistic to say that should anyone in their proximity create nuclear weapons, they'd feel threatened by that. And we've seen that even though in North Korea, people starve to death and the general population really doesn't have much to even live on, they keep spending more and more money on weaponry. So it's safe to say that should South Korea start producing nuclear weapons, the South Korean people would suffer slightly, but the North Korean people would suffer even more, because North Korea obviously does not have a problem prioritizing outward appearance and potency instead of the well-being of its inhabitants and the population. So basically, we as the opening government believe that not creating nuclear weapons is a form of peacekeeping. It's negative peacekeeping, but it's still peacekeeping. It means that there's money to go into more important things such as education and infrastructure. It means that there aren't alliances or, you know, countries bonding over shared enemies, but that they are instead focusing on the economy and, you know, the well-being of society. Whereas should South Korea produce nuclear weapons, there would be all the threats that we as the opening opposition have mentioned. There would be, you know, a new armament a new armament race, a waste of money, the money lacking elsewhere, and obviously through the new armament race there'd be new alliances between countries and potentially even the threat of war or a new Cold War, whatever, you know, in that dimension at least. And that's why we believe we should not produce, or South Korea should not produce nuclear weapons. Thank you.
I would like to thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition for that fine speech and welcome the Member of Government to open the closing half of this debate.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, give me just a second till I put the time. All right, so panel, a couple of things to start this off. I think none of the opening teams have actually told me like the problems that are happening in like the Asian region. And we think this is important because based on these problems, we have to decide whether it's better to have a nuclear weapon or not, right? I think even without the risk of being attacked by North Korea, we as government have to tell you why there's a need for South Korea to have nuclear weapons, right? So before that, a couple of rebuttals for the opening opposition. They tell us a couple of things. They tell us, one, that there's going to be an arms race in the region because North Korea is going to build more, it's going to build more nuclear weapons and South Korea is going to do the same thing. And it's just going to be very bad for the region, right? A couple of things. The reason why North Korea doesn't attack South Korea right now when it doesn't have nuclear weapons is because it has support from the US, it has support from like almost every democratic country in the world. And we think that if they don't attack South Korea right now when they don't have this army capabilities, then we don't think it's going to be much more like unlikely for them to attack them when they do have these nuclear weapons, right? We just think like the support from the US, like for example, is a very big detrimental for Kim Jong-un and his regiment, right? But secondly, I think like both of these countries have have families on both sides. Like they have they have grandparents on each side. So I think it's very unlikely that South Korea will actually want to engage in a war. We think this actually becomes better when they have nuclear weapons because they have this detrimental fear, not only for South Korea, but other countries in the region that could potentially invade them. We think this is much better to have the fear of knowing that you can be safe because you have this strong armament capacity, right? Secondly, I think opening opposition tells us about like that there's sectors within South Korea that need constant financial need. For example, like education, for example, construction, etc. We think that South Korea is actually a developed country panel. We think that it already has the needs, the basics of it, but just like the other money that it has, it can go into the nuclear weapons. We don't think this is like a very big issue. But even if it was, right, we think like the nationalist part of South Korea, that it has a very nationalist country, it has a very nationalist sense, actually makes it go forward because once it has like this capacity that they themselves think that they like the greatest country, we think it's actually much better for the country itself, right? Okay, so for the argumentation, right, we think that there is a market in Asian countries, right? We think that there's a very big tigers in the Asian countries, for example, China, for example, India. They have huge influences not only in the Asian market, but also in political decisions. That means that whenever they want to make like a trade between like Asian countries, they the powerhouses in these are China and India, for example, and they have much more control and autonomy versus they have, for example, South Korea or Bangladesh or etc. Right? We think that this change is actually necessary, and there is a need for becoming a powerhouse country in for South Korea, right? So we think like due to the economy, like China and India are very big, but they're also very big in terms of like combat abilities, right? They have a very large number of troops. They can, like, with any decision that they make, they can follow through with their weapons, etc. So we think like any decision that they make, there's going to be fear from like every other country in the region because they know it, right? So we think like this is very important because South Korea also needs to become a powerhouse country. They need to be able to make like these political decisions. They need to be able to make this change. And most importantly, they need to be able to make this fear of other countries that any decision that they make is going to be useful. Why? Because South Korea is a small country. Like with numbers, they can't compete in terms of troops. They can't compete in terms of like region that the other countries have. So they have to rely on this technological aspect of war. And technically, South Korea is one of the biggest countries technologically speaking. So we don't think this is going to be like that big of an issue. But we think when they do have nuclear weapons, it's going to, we're not saying in government that they're going to use them. Just the fact that they have them is a very big influence on the market, on trades, on having like trades from other Asian countries or other countries around the world, because they know that they have this capability of carrying out their decisions. And we think this is much better for South Korea as a country, right? So I think the point that opening government was trying to make about how they want to have this autonomy and how this powerhouse is actually based on the fact that South Korea is a very nationalist country, and because of this, they do want to get rid of America's like influence and all of that. We think like the proxy wars aren't that big of an issue right now in the world, but we think that this nationalist sense that the country has is actually the reasoning of why this country would want to have autonomy, would want to have like all of these powers, and would want to like be seen as the tiger of the region. We think this is very influential because of the market trades, right? So second point, we think there's an instability of leaders, right? We think there's a right-wing tendency in the world right now, for example, Trump, Bolsonaro, Kim Jong-un, and we think this is very detrimental, right? Because we don't know what these leaders are going to do. We don't know we know that they change their decisions rapidly, and we as a country need to have a certainty, at least for the safety of our citizens. Why? Because we have this social contract with our people that we need to protect them no matter the cost, even if it means going against education, which we seem very unlikely, but we need to protect them at any cost. We know that South Korea is an ally of the US, and we know that that's a very big detrimental to North Korea. But notice how when there's leaders like Trump, that like, for example, have been seen that are talking more with North Korea leaders rather than South Korea, we think this means that there's an uncertainty growing in the population because they don't know what's going to happen, right? If Kim Jong-un would attack South Korea right now, we don't know Trump's reaction because we've seen him being friends with North Korea leaders, right? So we think that it's going to be much better if we as a country would actually prepare and would actually produce these weapons, right? So even in opposition's best case scenario that the North Korea doesn't exist and there's not this immediate attack on danger and instability of leaders, we think that it's actually much better for them to have it, just to have an influence on the market, right? We think that these Asian countries are very prone to have their own ideology, and they all want to be like the tigers of the region. We think when they have this influence, they can spread it much more on other decision making that they want to do. Like for example, like the technologically speaking, trades companies that they want to do in any other region in the world. I think it's going to be much better when they're backed up by a country that has this very powerful nuclear weapons and all these sort of things. So I think in conclusion, it's going to be much better for like not only the country, but also for the safety of their citizens to actually have a much better ongoing country. And not only because of that, but because we need this detrimental fear to stop like other countries like China or Russia or India that we just don't know what's going to happen and we can necessarily compete with them because that's the market that we're living in today. Thank you.
I would like to thank the Member of Government for that fine speech and call on the Member of Opposition to extend on the closing up. One quick note on the POIs. I appreciate that this has been unclarity on my part. You don't write the actual POI in the chat, you just write POI team, and then the speaker can choose whether to accept or not accept the POI. At that point, you can unmute yourself and ask if you have been accepted. Otherwise, what happens is that the POI, even if it is rejected, is taken into account by me, and that would probably be problematic because speakers have agency over whether to accept it.
Okay, so wait, wait. I have to start the time, and I will start. Okay, so I'm starting that I have 2 rebuttals, and we have 3 main arguments, and it looks like we have 3 main arguments. So the opening government has said that we will have some autonomy from the United States as South Korea if we have a military power like the nuclear weapons. But the thing is that they're playing like the South Korea is not an independent country, an independent nation right now, and every decision is already taken by the USA. And, well, this is not the case. Instead, the presence of some allies gives us power in the region against North Korea and China, and also give us power regarding trade. And also, we can't understand why it would be nice to be losing our powerful allies, since if we are not close allies with USA, this would give an incentive to China and North Korea against us. So we think that the autonomy argument of the opening government has to be rethought, and also both government teams are saying that the presence of weapons could give way to the peace talks, and it could be used as a way, as a deterrent and as a way to create a balance of power in the region. But we believe that actually this is not the case, because the only reason that nuclear weapons has the power of being a deterrent or causing a balance of power is the fear element that is available in both sides. And if the current situation, the current fear element and the current balance of power changes, this means that with the bad decisions taken, millions of people will be actually dying. So the nature of the deterrent that comes with the nuclear weapons is very, very fragile. And we think that South Korea does not have to take such a risk for its population. So starting with our own arguments, the thing is that the race between the North Korea and South Korea is not only a race between those 2 countries, it's also includes 2 elements such as China and USA. The North Korea has the support of China. If it did not have the support of China, it would mean that it would have no incentive and no power of actually carrying out nuclear missile things in the previous years. It is because of the power and support of China that North Korea can have such a policy, we think. So keeping in this mind, if we don't have any nuclear weapons, it means that we have now the support of the international community, the USA, Western countries, and the European Union. If we go to nuclear weapons, it means that we will be losing our legitimacy in the international government, because a peace-loving state is the cause of the legitimacy in the eyes of the Western countries. And the reason why we are a powerful actor in Asia right now is because we have the support of USA and the European Union. It means that we will be losing this support and we will be left alone in the region. It means it will eventually it will give an incentive to China and North Korea to carry out a militarization act for our country. So we think that we should not give such an incentive to China. As we said, because of the creation of the United Nations Security Council or the NATO powers, the North Korea can do nothing without the support of China right now, because it has all of the international community instead of us. If he acts out in an aggressive manner, the only reason that he can do is because of the support of China. And if we go to the go to nuclear weapons, it means that the support of USA would diminish for our country. Well, let's put it like that. The reason why we don't have a war or a more aggressive situation in the Korean Peninsula is right now because of the balance of power between USA and China. So if we go to nuclear weapons, USA would would stop supporting us, but China would still support North Korea, because like as there are some authoritarian regimes, they don't have any kind of thought about getting votes or stuff. They don't have to think a second time when they are engaging in a aggressive manner, because they're authoritarian regimes. They don't have a fear of losing votes or something. So China would still have an incentive to support North Korea, but we would be left alone. And actually, this means that even if we don't have a full-scale war, the China and North Korea would have an open excuse for engaging in further and further militarization, and in the future it might even lead to a hot war in the Korean Peninsula, since we don't have any or that powerful international support left. The only power that we had as South Korea against North Korea was the international support that we had, and by going to the militarization, we are losing this support. This is very important. And also, the foreign investors know that the situation in the Korean Peninsula is very, very fragile. And the reason why our economy is really, really powerful right now is because of the catch-up growth that we achieved in the 20th century, and it was because of the foreign investors and the support of the USA. Since the foreign investors know that the nature of the peninsula is very fragile, if we go to a militarization act, it means that they probably will know that there might be a war and there might be some political tension in the peninsula. So they won't be any willing to they won't be any willing to giving money and engaging in investing acts in our country. We would be losing our trade agreements and it would cause the South Korean economy to diminish in a very significant level. So let's think it about that way. You have a trade agreement with Samsung or Hyundai as a US investor, and you know that the South Korea is engaging in a militarization act, so you will probably be thinking that the possibility of the trade agreement will of not being achieved is really, really high right now, because there might be a war or there might be another action taken by China. So as a foreign investor, you won't be coming to South Korea or Asia. So this means that our economic growth and the state of our economy will be also very problematic, and our currency will actually again face a lot of problems. So for the sake of our international presence of our international allies and the state of our economy, we believe that we should go for peace and not engage in militarization. Thank you.
I would like to thank the member of the opposition for that fine speech and call on the government whip to summarize this debate for said government.
All right, panel. Notice how if closing opposition's reasoning was true, then when India and Pakistan had nuclear weapons, then they would have lost all the support from the US, all the support from the European countries. We don't think just by having nuclear weapons, you necessarily lose every support internationally that you have. And even if you did, closing opposition never gave you the reasoning as to why the US will immediately lose you the support. I think this is a very big, I don't think this is a very reasoned argument, but it actually doesn't even make sense, because the US supports South Korea to counterbalance the power that North Korea has, just because being in close proximity being like on the borders. We don't think that it makes any sense just because South Korea has nuclear weapons and the US is going to be like, oh, we're going to leave South Korea and everything's going to be all right, because it actually wants to have a base, like OG talked about, because of the power structure of China, Russia, North Korea. I think it actually doesn't make sense to take it away. Secondly, they talk about the economic sectors, like when there's wars, the U.S. investors are not going to invest anything, and the currency is going to fall, and South Korea is going to go badly. Like, even if there was a war, we think it's actually a very profitable business, and we think a lot of investors are going to come. But we actually don't think that's actually the case, because South Korea is one of the biggest technological countries in the region. Like they have the 5G, they have like all of these advanced technological systems. We think like investors actually go to other countries that have far more serious risk. For example, in the Middle East, for example, in South America, just because like they have these nuclear weapons, we don't think that these investors are not going to come. And even if they don't, like I think it's going to be very profitable in terms of war. So it doesn't balance out, right? So what did we bring you from closing government that's so important, right? I think it was a couple of things. I think it's the first, like we talked about the instability of leaders and the reasoning behind it, in knowing how we don't know how Trump is going to act. We have this uncertainty in the region. And that means that we, as a principle, we have this social contract to protect our own people. And we think that it's actually much better for us to protect them versus than just to depend on another country. But secondly, we actually made clash with all of opposition when they talk about how North Korea is going to have this more proxy war and it's going to be bad for the region. We actually explained it, how when there is a much more power struggle, for example, there's a third powerhouse country that actually is born, not just India, not just China, but now there's actually a much more competitive market. And that means that the trades and the influences that South Korea is going to get, it's going to be much better, just because they're going to be seen as having this military capacity to actually follow through on everything that they want to say. And we think this is actually much better for the economy of South Korea and for the region as a whole, right? So I think those are the clashes that we made. But secondly, we actually told you how even if there wasn't a North Korea, and even if there wasn't this immediate threat and danger, right, they should still do it just because of their own ideology and of carrying out this political decision and change. Notice how in Asia, whenever they want to make a change, usually the ones that have the more say and the ones that have the more vote, for example, in the UN conferences, are China and India, just because they have like this fear and this power that they're associated with. Notice how, for example, the countries that have veto rights in the UN are like the 5 biggest countries and strongest when the UN was originated. We think this is actually very key in the part, not just being like rich technologically and rich in other things, but also having the power to negotiate in terms of like strength and in terms of nuclear weapons. We think this is actually much better, right? When OG told you about the argument of autonomy and of the proxy war and how it wants to get rid of the influence on the region for the US, they actually missed a logical link on how South Korea is a very nationalist country, and because of this nationalism, they're willing to go that far to get rid of the US's influence on them. We think this comes from our side and actually comes to us. But even if proxy wars aren't that big of a thing, and even if it doesn't change the influences, we think like just the narrative of South Korea of having this autonomy, for example, of knowing that they can like attack another country or knowing that they can defend themselves when they need to, is actually a very huge deal, because then this plays in the internal economy of the country by having very nationalist people, by working really harder because they love their country. We think this comes from our side only. And we think that we necessarily win against opening opposition's case, because even if what they told us was true, I think it was very big impacted, and I don't think it had like all the reasonings behind it. So even if like rebuttals, for example, like that they have families on both sides, or for example that North Korea doesn't necessarily attack South Korea just because of the support from the US, and it's going to be less of an attack when they actually have like more weapons and they have more armament capacity. We don't think that opening opposition case follows, right? So the reason why we actually win from closing opposition's team is because they never tell us the reasoning as to why the US is going to just go away from South Korea just because they have the weapons. They would have need to prove as that, for example, why this didn't happen in India, why this didn't happen in Pakistan, and why this has never happened in countries that have these weapons. But notice that when you have these weapons, you actually are considered a much stronger country with a much bigger influence. So even if all of this happened, we think that the ability of South Korea to insert their own ideology and insert their own ways of thinking onto another country or onto like trades and unions is actually going to be much bigger. But we think even if they lose the support from the US, it just doesn't make sense in terms of like the power struggle there, right? So the second point So necessarily we win for all of these reasons, but also because we talked about the political decisions and change that actually want to happen in Asian countries. We think this is actually important for South Korea to stay ahead of the game because of the competitiveness that the market follows. Because if you're not one of the key players, then you're just like offering your services to another one of the key players, for example. And we think this is very important. Right? So in conclusion, we think like all of the arguments from opposition have been rebutted, but even if they have been rebutted, even if there is not this immediate pressure from North Korea or China and Russia to have this safety, we think it's actually much more beneficial for South Korea to like be able to compete in terms of the market in Asia.
I would like to thank the government whip for that fine speech and call on the opposition whip to close this debate and summarize it for side opposition.
Can you hear me?
Thank you everyone for what I think was an extremely engaging debate. I'm going to give you the call. I'm going to give a couple of points of feedback that I think are helpful for everyone in this debate. Then run through the call chronologically to justify how teams took the position that they did. And then afterwards, I think we'll have probably a good bit of minutes to chat about individual feedback if people are interested in that as well. If at any point there are questions, usually at the point where I finish explaining something, I will open that up to questions so that anyone who has them can unmute themselves and ask. Right. At the end of this debate, I wound up giving the first to closing government, the second to opening opposition, the third to opening government, and the fourth, unfortunately, to closing opposition. I think all positions in this debate are potentially quite close, and I'm going to try and make everything very, very clear as I run through it. Before that, though, because I think it's helpful for clarification, I'm going to run through 3 general feedback. The first is on framing, and for this, I think actually this debate is a very nice sort of illustrative example, which is to say, I think there are things that the other side will be able to claim that are incredibly hard to fully disprove, and there are things that your side will be able to claim that are incredibly hard to fully disprove. As one example, in this debate, I think government will almost certainly be able to prove that this to some extent increases the ability to which South Korea can autonomously ensure its own safety. So without the need for allies and without the need to be spending on anything else, nuclear weapons are probably quite good for making sure you don't get attacked. Similarly, opposition will almost certainly, I think even almost definitionally be able to prove that there are significant financial costs to maintaining nuclear weapons. And I think even it is even quite hard for a government to disprove that there will probably be some degree of increased militarization as a result of it. Given that, the central locus where you win this debate from either side is in giving me a framing of the world, either of those impacts is particularly significant. So for the government impact of being able to autonomously ensure your own safety, which you're definitely going to prove, I think I need to understand why it is essential, one, that there is a threat to South Korea's safety. Secondly, why being able to secure it without the aid of others is particularly important. I think one example for that, which I think indeed happens in the winning team in this debate, CG, is the idea that the US, so external grantors of safety are not reliable, so they are unlikely to be providing this aid, therefore South Korea needs to do it themselves, is something that is proven. I think that's one way of doing that. I think there's also like some principled analysis in terms of every country owes it to its citizens to be able to protect them, regardless of whether other countries kick them to the curb. I think there's a lot of material that is plausible there. Similarly, I think in opposition, given the fact that you will definitely be able to prove that there's just literal costs to doing this, explaining why spending that money elsewhere or signaling that you are willing to take on those costs is something that is particularly detrimental. So I think that opening opposition takes a shot at this in terms of saying this is otherwise spent on education or social services. I think similarly, one could argue about the idea that at the point where you demonstrate that you prioritize military over economy, that signals to your neighbors that it is no longer safe because they perceive that there might be like border conflicts, etc., which means they have to themselves also support the army, which I think is something that is attempted but not fully proven within the opposition bench. All of those are ways in which you can make your sort of inherent side of the motion significantly more important, purely in terms of framing. The second thing that I want to talk about in terms of feedback, before that, are there any questions on this? Am I speaking into the void?
No, Crystal. I have no Crystal.
No questions here.
Okay. Thank you. Right. Second point, I think, is mechanistic depth, because I think this debate is mechanistically quite dense insofar as people are trying to prove a variety of processes happen as a result of South Korea producing nuclear weapons, especially at the point where those processes involve other actors behaving in a certain way. So either North Korea being more willing to negotiate or surrounding countries being more militarized and spending on an arms race. I think this debate was at times a bit shallow in terms of characterizing why those actors behave in the way that they do. What I personally find very helpful for doing so is to think about it in terms of electoral politics. Now, I understand electoral politics isn't the only determining factor of things in the world, but conceptualizing things in terms of, okay, at the point where a country next to me has just decided to produce the most destructive weapons ever known to man, that means my own population is probably quite scared, either because they're scared of this country or because they're scared that this means that there's some external threat that threatens us both. That means in order to be popular and win the next elections in my country, what I promise my population is that I will spend a lot on military to make sure that they are safe. Populations tend to prioritize safety over other things, because even if maybe being a bit richer is nice, being alive is even better. At that point, it is very, very hard to justify other policies. At that point, it is hard to, for instance, be the politician that is against increasing military funding, because everyone will attack you on, oh, so you don't really, population is safe. I think that is a clearer mechanism for why, for instance, increased militarization is likely to occur in neighboring countries. That makes it more plausible for me. But I think this similarly applies to government mechanisms in terms of other countries being more willing to negotiate with you or give you better deals at the point where you have nuclear weapons, because a lot of that mechanism isn't obvious. The initial line is, but why the actors in question would behave in the way that you frame is not. And I think going into significantly greater mechanistic depth for explaining that would be useful. The third thing, and after that I'm actually going to go into code explanation, is going into, I think, greater clarity on impacts and sort of finishing them up, because I'm reasonably clear on, okay, we get somewhat more militarism versus we get somewhat more safety, but I am unsure why I would prefer one or the other, even to the degree that maybe both of them happen, right? It is entirely possible for South Korea to be better able to defend itself, yet also surrounded with more warlike countries. And I'm genuinely unsure which of the two of them is more significant at the point where you don't frame what that looks like, either for a person on the ground or for decision makers or for anyone else with any degree of clarity beyond stating that. Because ultimately, those are impacts that are extremely hard to quantify. There isn't like a number value of like, I don't know, higher safety by factor 75. So in order to be comparing them, I need clarity on what they look like, because that is the only metric I have. That like makes it likelier for me to sway your way on any given call, because I am simply less likely to just listen to my own intuitions, which unfortunately sometimes in debates when I'm not given impact framing, I have to do. Are there any questions on these last 2 points of sort of feedback / suggestions?
I have a question.
Yes, absolutely.
You talked about how you could frame it in terms of like opposition and like electoral.
The crucial thing that obviously on government, I think both teams were trying to claim, was negotiations with other countries. I think in OG, this is you're likelier to go to the negotiating table with North Korea and achieve a good deal. I think in CG, this is the material on being able to compete with India and China more effectively, right? I think the way that you can do this is a couple of, the first is, I think actually the parallel version of this framing. So North Korea, at the point where it is able to say, look at the South Koreans who are weak, who are dependent on the outside for their aid, us continuing to antagonize them is what we should do righteously, because that is what we do as a part of the history of the Korean War, because they attack us, etc. At the point, however, where it is very clear that any conflict with South Korea would be incredibly destructive, where, and I think this is where you probably switch away from electoral politics and more toward like the politics of Kim Jong-un, the generals surrounding him know that they will die, that their families will die if there's conflict with South Korea, where they can be completely and utterly certain of that, because South Korea, at the point where it has second strike capability, will never like lose without also nuking the fuck out of North Korea. that means that they have a massively different decision-making calculus. That means they don't want to be increasing the chances of that war. That means they want to have assurances that it doesn't happen. If Kim Jong-un does not comply with that, they will try and have a coup because they want personally to be safe, even if he is an irrational actor. As a result of that, you get them to the negotiating table. In parallel, going toward like the material that happens in CG, I think the way that you frame it is, the reason why countries give better deals to stronger military powers isn't because they think the individual deal will be enforced with nuclear weapons. I think that's intuitive. They do so because they perceive that being aligned with this country is good for you overall, because you know that at the point where you have, e.g., a mutually beneficial like treaty on economics, that means that this country also has a stake in your safety, because they only get something out of having like a common currency with you or whatever, at the point where you are not preoccupied with being in a conflict otherwise. They will support you, they will keep you safe. That means that you can justify very easily to your population that you are giving them a particularly good deal because they expect extraneous benefits from that, other than just the deal in particular. What happens with an opening government in terms of the case is, firstly, the idea that you increase South Korea's independence from the US, specifically for the purpose of its safety. And secondly, that as a result of being removed from the sort of sphere of proxy war by the US, that also means they will be able to improve relationship with North Korea. I think essentially this is framed in terms of nuclear diplomacy. I think the mechanisms for how nuclear diplomacy works aren't particularly intuitive, but I certainly think that the absence of the US, which has previously increased the potential for conflict, makes it plausible that it is somewhat more possible, at least prima facie, that you have reconciliation with North Korea. I think secondly, the argument for autonomy sort of in principle stands regardless. What happens in opening opposition? How is it challenged? I think the first thing is a good amount of framing from opening opposition as for why North Korea, at the point where they perceive South Korea doing this, is likely to perceive it as a threat because they see South Korea gaining even more power. Secondly, that South Korea presumably retained at least some of its Western allies, at which point it is unclear why you actually get the conflict resolution. And that as a result of that, because you want to be showing that you are still militarily strong, and also this applies to other countries within that region, you also build first thing is that while autonomy is clear to me as for why it could happen as a result of this, it is unclear why it necessarily materializes, because I am not sure why, even at the point where South Korea has nuclear weapons, that means they are necessarily fully autonomous from the US otherwise, or indeed why their government would choose to be so. At which point, while autonomy would be a value were it realized, I am unsure whether it will be. And this is implicitly challenged by opening opposition in their characterization that the Western alliance presumably stays in place. This also weakens the consequential impact in opening government in terms of being able to reconcile, because again, while it is clear to me why that would be possible, I am unsure why it is likely to occur as a direct result of the policy. Whereas I think opening opposition manages to link at least some, albeit not all of their impacts, quite directly to this policy in terms of, one, the direct costs, but two, the cost of putting military more on the agenda and over-focusing on it at the expense of other things. Given that, while I think opening up government give me a framing for why one barrier to their impact accruing is removed, I don't think they realize why, therefore, that impact actually happens, positively speaking. Given that, in terms of probability weighting, I think the probability of the impacts in opening opposition is higher than the probability of the impacts in opening government. I am unsure which of these is more important. Probably on intuition basis, I would lean toward it's probably better to have reconciliation with like a decade-long enemy than necessarily have somewhat better functioning economy. But I don't think that weighing is actually ever made in opening government. And at that point, I have to assume the impacts are probably reasonably-ish equal, especially given the fact that I think a lot of the material on why reconciliation would be important, namely your own safety, is mitigated in opening up to say that you are probably to some degree already safe as a result of external support. Are there questions within the top half?
Nope, sounds plausible.
No
Okay.
biter.
Okay, let's move on toward what we get out of closing. We, yes, we, cat, this one person. What I get out of closing government. I think there's basically three broad thrusts of impact. The first is the idea that it creates a significant degree of additional felt safety within the South Korean population. I think, secondly, the idea that it enables South Korea to be a big player within Asia by having nuclear weapons. And I think, thirdly, there is the idea that as a result of the instability of the international support that South Korea presently enjoys, it is essential to be able to autonomously provide for its own safety. Sort of secondly or secondarily within CG, I get quite a lot of quite strong responses to this closing opposition, but I think also to some extent mitigatory responses to opening opposition. What specifically I think is essential is the framing that I get on why this is necessary right now. And I understand it necessarily given an awful lot of analysis, but given that it is unengaged, I think that it is reasonable to accept that South Korea needs to be able to autonomously do this because it is unlikely to enjoy US support in the actual long run. Given the fact that opening opposition specifically has never proven why that support is likely to be lasting and likely to be sufficient, giving some analysis as for why it might vanish, given that other teams in this debate have agreed that there is to some degree at least a hypothetically hostile power next to South Korea, I'm willing to believe that it is much more important than I previously did that they are able to do this effectively. I think there is some idea of mitigation with regard to the idea that you are wasting money, insofar as I'm willing to believe that to some extent this doesn't necessarily mean you never develop. So I'm willing to believe that this money could be better allocated, but I don't think you're necessarily actively harming your population by not spending it. And you do generate a greater degree of perceived or felt safety within it. I'm not sure why it is necessarily crucial that people feel safer, but I'm willing to buy that it is true. At that point, in terms of trade, like what happens with regard to opening opposition versus closing government is that the trade-off for why we would be willing to incur the cost that you talk about with regard to an arms race, I think closing government give me a stronger justification than opening government for why that would be true, namely that we may actually need to provide for our own safety, materially, practically speaking, at one point in the near future. I think, secondly, the specific response that I get in terms of the idea of getting additional conflict within the region is probably to some extent still reasonable in terms with regard to the idea that there would, generally speaking, already be some degree of conflict potential, etc. I'm unsure to what degree it is plausible that there is a direct threat, and I think this is plausibly the biggest weakness in the closing gov case, insofar as I don't think they necessarily prove why it is structurally necessary to be able to defend yourself, but I'm willing to believe that it is true, and especially given the fact that opening the opposition's response relied heavily on North Korea being the kind of country that would attack at the point where it could. I think opening opposition have conceded this, at which point the absence of another defense is sufficient to prove that there is actual military threat. Just as a general note, I don't necessarily buy the stuff about being able to play a greater role within the Asian economy and diplomatic world, because I'm unsure where it is linked to nuclear weapons. I think the analogy that is given is membership of the UN Security Council, but even that is vaguely counterintuitive, because the examples that are given by CG themselves, e.g. India and Pakistan, e.g. Pakistan, is not on the UN Security Council, so I'm unsure why necessarily international influence arises from having nuclear weapons in the first place. But I think the responses combined with the framing are sufficient still to take it over the top half. Are there questions?
No, that's clear to me.
Grand. All right. Let's move on toward what we get out of closing opposition. I think closing opposition actually does a mechanistically very good job of proving some of their stuff. I think the trouble that happens, and I'm going to be highlighting this as I run through the case and do comparison, is that it's not necessarily clear how a variety of the things in question are exclusive in the debate. The first of these is the question of whether you lose international support at the point where you have nuclear weapons. I think the second is the question of like lost foreign direct investment. Starting with international support. I think this is initially plausible. I am unsure to what degree it is impacted. So I think the impacting that you give for this is we may actually be invaded by North Korea. I think this is counterintuitive given the prior framing. I think that happens even already in Prime Minister, why at the point where you do have nuclear weapons, that's extremely unlikely. Other than that, I'm unsure what the international support meaningfully does for South Korea beyond ensuring its safety, which I have to concede to government bench, they probably do with nuclear weapons as well. The second point is interesting though, which is to say that you lose foreign direct investment at the chance of an increased risk of war because the foreign direct investors perceive their investment as being at risk of being potentially, I don't know, less likely to pay off if there is a higher risk of war. I think this is initially plausible, and initially I was considering that this might be a more probable mechanism for why you actually long run harm the economy of South Korea than I got out of opening opposition. The reason that it doesn't work though is that it is contingent, for being true, on investors actually perceiving a higher chance of war. I don't think you prove that yourselves, because I don't think the mechanism of lost international support proves a higher risk of war, as I went through before. I think secondly, the trouble with it is that if I were to believe that this is true, I would have to believe first all the analysis from opening opposition in terms of why there is higher risk of conflict, etc., of which I think they've already given me a decent amount of impact. So while loss of foreign direct investment is certainly one thing that happens if I buy the OO analysis on higher chance of conflict, I'm not sure why it is the most important one, or indeed why it is the most exclusive one, or why South Korea not building nuclear weapons, given the framing that I've just been given by closing government, to which you have a burden to respond because you speak after them, unlike opening opposition, have stated that there is a risk of conflict anyway if the US leaves South Korea alone and they would have to defend themselves. At that point, I am unsure why lost foreign direct investment is fully exclusive to the government in this debate, and it might happen on your side as well. Therefore, it is not a direct link to the construction of nuclear weapons by South Korea. I think this also largely explains why closing opposition loses the closing half of this debate. Additionally to the response that I get out of government whip with regard to like the analogy to India and Pakistan. I understand that there's a comeback to that, which is that India and Pakistan are meaningfully different from North and South Korea, but I'm unsure analytically, structurally, what that difference is, at which point I think the response is probably sufficiently destructive to say that there is no additional incremental impact relative to closing government from closing opposition. I think I've largely run through why I think the opening opposition takes it over closing opposition, insofar as I think the limited, there is a very limited exclusive extension that stands, logically speaking, within the debate that is not running on the basis of a defeated claim about increased conflict or opening opposition's claim about increased conflict. Lastly, with regard to the long diagonal, so OG and CO. I think this is partly a little bit difficult to trade off insofar as I clearly can't credit OG for CG's rebuttal, at which point parts of the CO case certainly still stand relative to the OG case. I think the point of information with regard to proximity not necessarily being relevant for the impact of nuclear weapons is, however, quite clever, because it does undermine large parts of your case that are contingent on there being additional probability of conflict, independently from the responses that I get from CG about India-Pakistan, which is to say that clearly there's already quite a bit of chance for conflict, so any impact that you tie to that are unlikely to accrue. I think that is sufficient engagement, given the fact that you don't explicitly trade off against the material, like the standing material on autonomy and being able to fractionally more likely reconcile with North Korea. At that point, I think opening government takes it over closing opposition. Are there questions on this?
Nope.
No.
Are there questions on anything else? I'm really not super comfortable giving sort of personal feedback in rooms that are, one, recorded, and two, have everyone else in them. Do you guys have means of contacting me? I guess you're all in the